following episode contains racial hatred, language, racist epithets, and foul language. Listener discretion is advised.
We don't play games here anymore, okay? Next time you ever talk to me like that, you're gonna get your ass kicked by my family. And they're gonna fuck you up.
What did I do?
Right. They're gonna fuck you
Why?
up.
What did I do?
Because you are an asshole. Look at the whole stairs to
But
yourself.
you had these
Why
stairs
don't
and
you go
that
somewhere
stairs.
else where you can go to a gym? This is not just for you.
Oh, you
Get
need
the fuck out of this world. Get the fuck out of this state. Go back to whatever fucking Asian country you belong in.
Okay,
You little
racist.
fucking bitch. This is not your place. This is not your home. We do not want you here. You put that on Facebook. I hope you do. Because every fucking person will beat the crap out of you from here on out. Don't you ever say, oh, Jesus, to me when I want to use the stairs, you little bitch.
There's other stairs.
You are a sick, fucking, ignorant teenager.
Oh,
Oh,
thank
wait,
you.
Fucking what, middle-aged woman? Who wears black in California sun? Who the fuck wears black? Are you an idiot? You wear black in California sun? Seriously?
And who the fuck are you being a racist in this country? Who the fuck are you bullying and racially harassing a teenager, as you call her? Who the fuck are you as a white woman to come up to someone who is just minding her own business as a human being and start abusing them and hating them? What the fuck is wrong with you? You are a grown-ass woman. You need to look at yourself. That's what you need to do. And examine why your life is so miserable and why you are so poisoned with hatred. I disagree with the corporate news media calling this America in crisis. What this really is white Americans in crisis. What will white Americans do this November? That's the focus of this edition of The Politicrat. Welcome to The Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore. It is Friday, June the 12th, 2020. There is a lot to chew over on this episode. A confluence of events here in the United States and of commemorations here in the United States. Medgar Evers was assassinated 57 years ago today, right in his driveway, down in Mississippi. The civil rights leader, member of the NAACP, World War II veteran, assassinated in his driveway 57 years ago today in 1963. Four years later, you had the landmark United States Supreme Court decision, Loving versus Virginia, which overturned the Virginia anti-miscegenation statute that forbade black people and white people from marrying each other. That said that no person of a different race could marry someone of a different race. No one could marry of different races. That's what the Virginia statute said, and that is what Richard Loving and Mildred Jeter had taken to the Supreme Court. They were a white man and black woman who had married. And Virginia said that their marriage was not lawful. And so that Supreme Court fight, that long fight, went all the way to the Supreme Court, and ultimately on this day, on this very day, back in 1967, that is now some 53 years ago today, the U.S. Supreme Court said that people can marry whomever they want to marry from a different race. There are so many different events going on today alone. We have also been dealing with some important developments as far as law enforcement is concerned. We have been dealing with a statement from at least 14 Minneapolis police officers who have said that the killer cop, who is now an ex-cop, Derek Chauvin, who of course was on the Minneapolis police force when he murdered George Floyd just over 2 weeks ago, almost 3 weeks ago now. Those 14 officers made a statement today saying that the actions of Derek Chauvin do not represent who we are as police. That is what they said in a statement today. On another front, the New York State Governor, Andrew Cuomo, made some significant news with a quite landmark signing of legislation that is going to, I think, lead to some significant changes. Now, in a moment, I'm going to play some audio, but the main theme of this episode is, obviously, it is clear that slowly but surely, the United States of America, thanks to protesters, the vast majority of them young protesters, are forcing the country, and these are black protesters, white protesters, Latinx protesters, Asian protesters, Native American protesters, gay protesters, straight protesters, are forcing this country and its institutions, many of them racist institutions, they are forcing the country to examine itself and unlearn itself and change itself. They are forcing that. It's happening before our eyes. And although the cable news media in the United States has already taken its cameras away from all the cities across the country that are demonstrating and protesting, These protests continue. They are happening still all over the United States of America and beyond. The media has chosen, in large part, to no longer cover the marches. It's back to coronavirus, as if the media is not capable of covering more than one thing at once. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences today announced some sweeping changes. Diversity training has been happening. Sensitivity training has been happening amongst Academy members. There's also been a change in the requirements for Best Picture, which will be fixed at 10 films. But all of those films will be required, as will any film for consideration, be required to have diversity, inclusion in the cast and beyond. That is something that the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences announced today. Now, this will begin with the Oscars in 2021, which, if they are to be held, and it looks like they will be held, will be literally early next year. That is the new benchmark coming out of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. This is an organization that for 93 years, has only had one Best Actress winner be a black woman. And that was Halle Berry for the film Monsters Ball. And she won that Oscar in 2002. She is the only black woman to win Best Actress. There has never been an Asian woman win Best Actress. The Academy has never, ever had a black director win Best Director in the 92 plus years of its existence. There has never been a black female director nominated for Best Director in the 92 plus years of the Academy. There have only been 2 Best Picture winners that have been directed by black people. One of them was 12 Years a Slave. In 2014 was when it won the Oscar for Best Picture. The other film was Moonlight. And that was the winner of Best Picture in 2017. You remember that, when they read out La La Land first, and then it turned out, remember that whole thing of Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway, Mr. and Mrs. Bonnie and Clyde, and it turned out that, they got the wrong envelope, and it was actually Moonlight that won Best Picture. Barry Jenkins directed Moonlight. Steve McQueen directed 12 Years a Slave. Those are the only 2 Best Picture winners directed by black filmmakers, both black men. Of course, this year we had the film Parasite, the first film from South Korea to win Best Picture. In fact, the first film in a foreign language to win Best Picture. In an international language, I should say. not in the English language, as it were. So these are some institutional changes that are happening. Now, some of them are major, and I'll play this video coming up because I think it's important. But with all of this said, what about the average white person? And I'm not talking about the white person that was protesting and standing up and clearly being anti-racist and demonstrating a commitment to it by marching, but not just by marching, but by speaking up and speaking out and talking about white silence being violence. I'm not talking about the mostly under 50s who had that refrain. I'm talking about people over 50, but I'm also talking about the people who weren't in the streets with those white protesters. What will they be doing on November 3rd, 2020? Will they be choosing the United States of America? Or will they be choosing Donald Trump and the Confederacy? The Confederacy that lost the Civil War. The Confederacy that was a traitor to the country. The Confederacy that believed in enslavement and held black people in bondage and enslavement. The Confederacy that wanted to preserve enslavement. Which will white people choose this November 3rd? Welcome back. There's also that audio that you heard at the beginning of this episode of a white woman in California, down in Torrance, that's in Southern California, who, as I mentioned, was racially abusing a woman, a Filipino woman apparently, who was just minding her own business. Minding her own business. And I think that Donald Trump will have no problem getting her vote. He has gone all in, as he has done for the vast majority of his 73 plus years on this planet. He has gone all in on racism because he is a racist himself. And he is banking on the age-old tactic of many white politicians, which is to divide along racial lines in order to try and win an election. Remember that most white people did not vote for Hillary Clinton in 2016. Most white people voted for Donald Trump. 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump, and something like 65% of white men voted for Donald Trump. The question is, will those numbers change? Meaning, will those numbers go down? Will they decrease? Will there be less white men and women voting for Donald Trump on November 3rd of this year? Or will there be more white men and women doing so? Polls can say lots of things in June. Polls can say lots of things in July. But polls, as the pollster Cornell Belcher, I believe his name is, has said often, polls are but a representation of a snapshot in time. And while at this time, in June of 2020, polls show Joe Biden way ahead of Donald Trump. It is useful and instructive to remind people that exactly 4 years ago, these same polls had Hillary Clinton way ahead of Donald Trump. That continued throughout the fall as well, into October, even into early November, when the New York Times famously said that Hillary Clinton had an 85% chance of winning. That was literally something that was said on the day of the election, if not the day before, in the New York Times. And we all know what happened on November 8th into November 9th, 2016. We all know that, as I said in yesterday's episode, that Republican vote stealing is going on at a staggering and alarming rate. That is happening as I speak. The question becomes, with black turnout inevitably going through the roof this time around, and with Latinos galvanized against Trump, even with Joe Biden's problematic approach toward Latinos simply because he was tied to Barack Obama and his immigration policies at times in terms of deportation, it will not be up to black women to save the United States of America yet again. Joe Biden will have to pick a black woman as his running mate. There's no question. He will have to do that. But it is not black women who need to save the United States of America yet again. It is white women and white men who will have to do that. And not only save America this coming November, but start to save themselves right now. Look in to your heart, to your soul. Ask yourself, why don't you speak up when something racist happens right in front of you? When someone is insulted, when someone does the insulting and says, "Oh, I'm only joking." Ask yourself why you don't challenge that. And ask yourself if you should start to challenge it. And say to yourself that maybe you should, and not maybe. You should challenge it. And it's those everyday things rather than that racist tirade that you heard at the beginning of this episode that is going to have to be the crisis of conscience for white people in this country, I believe, to start to change their own hearts and minds, to unlearn the poisons of racism and racist hatred. Unlearn the kinds of things that their parents taught them. You will have to unlearn that. And if your parents did not teach you to hate, where did you get the hate from? Was it a friend? Was it a neighbor? Was it your lover? Was it a relative? Was it from the television? From the U.S. government? From some Nazi? Some Klan member? Some other racist? A teacher at school? White celebrities can choose to do PSAs about taking responsibility, however sincere or insincere you may think they are. But what they have to do beyond a 2-minute video is in their everyday lives practice the actuality of putting these things into action by speaking out, by actually ceding their positions, sharing their positions, yielding their positions surrendering their positions of power in Hollywood, in athletics, or wherever it might be, to a black person. That is the kind of thing that white people in positions of power are going to have to do. If you want a just society, if you want a society based on fairness and equity, if you want to be an anti-racist, this is how you start being an anti-racist. 1 2-minute video will not suffice. Here's what one white person of power chose to do today. And here is the audio for that.
It took a number of lives, unfortunately. It took a number of injustices, unfortunately. But each one was a part in getting to today. And it was Reverend Sharpton standing up and making sure the people of this nation heard every time every injustice happened. And that Reverend, is a special ability, a special contribution. And you have been there year after year after year. And we all respect your effort. We thank you for what you've done. We thank you for your voice, which the nation has heard, this state has heard. And not only did we hear you, we're going to make a difference. And this state is going to make a difference. And I believe it's going to be a difference that's going to resonate all across the nation. Because what we're doing here, making every police agency come to the table with the community, that should be done in every police agency in this country. Together we'll make it happen. Reverend Sharpton.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you to the Speaker and the Senate, the Majority Leader. Let me first say this is a great day for advocates. And though I appreciate the Speaker's words, but as I stood on many of these marches and protests, there were many that will never sit next to the governor that march, many that will never have their names called. And it's a great day for them, advocacy groups that are not as known as National Action Network, but advocated anyway. So I sit here for them as well. Some of us may not even get along, but it's a victory for all of us. And we must monitor to make sure that it's done. I'm glad that Hazel Dukes is here, who is going to jail with me in some of the protests around this issue. And I'm most glad for the mothers who, no matter what we do, will always have an empty seat at the family dinner table and the holidays. I talk to the mothers every holiday.
That's just a part of what you heard there was first New York State Governor Andrew Cuomo with landmark legislation. I mean, what he signed, I'll get into in a moment. Then the second voice you heard was Reverend Al Sharpton. Governor Cuomo today signed into law legislation that repeals all kinds of things as far as police is concerned. 50-A, I guess that's a provision I'm not familiar with. But this legislation also bans chokeholds, prohibits any kind of false race-based 911 calls, 911 calls. So the Amy Coopers of the world will have to crawl back into their holes, into their caves. Because if they dare pull what Amy Cooper and many other white people across this country have pulled, at least if they pull this in New York State, they will be prosecuted. They will be arrested and prosecuted. New York State has become the first state in the country to act upon this with this legislation. Also saying that the Attorney General, in this case in New York, the Attorney General is Tish James, who probably is going to become governor one of these days, probably very soon. And if she's not governor, she'll be mayor of New York City. But I suspect that she may well become governor in a few short years after Andrew Cuomo either has a term run out or is no longer allowed to run. I think there's a very good chance she is going to put her hat in the ring, but that's for another day. But this legislation would make Letitia James, who's doing an excellent job, by the way, as New York State's Attorney General, she would be the independent prosecutor. So there would always be, no matter who it is, Tish James or whomever, will always be the de facto and will be the default special prosecutor in any killings of unarmed civilians by police. I mean, look, I've always been critical. I've always doubted the word. When I hear the word reform, I hear something that's very system-oriented. I hear something that sounds like systemic language. In fact, that word reform is very much of a systemic word. One of those kinds of words that suggests that there will be some changes, but it will essentially be tinkering around the edges. That's what I hear when I hear the word reform. But this today was certainly a little bit beyond that. The only thing that I would have wanted to add to that legislation would be to take some money from the police unions and try to dilute their significance. Police unions have extraordinary power in this country. In fact, they have more power than most other unions have. Because most of the unions in the United States have been decimated significantly over the last 40 plus years due to Ronald Reagan and others. But Ronald Reagan, when he fired the air traffic controllers in the early 1980s, set this tone. But police unions need to be weakened. They are too powerful. They have shaped too much of policy in this country where policing is concerned. Governor Cuomo certainly, though, today, I think, did a very good thing. And though I've been critical of him on a number of occasions, he, in his budget, just this year, had cuts for Medicaid, which affects the very people who are being killed by police. And I don't think he's been all that great, by the way, in handling the coronavirus situation either, this pandemic in New York State. I don't think he's been great with handling detainees. He's had to be pressured into it. I think he's shown a lot of contempt towards them. And to the homeless, to a degree as well. On this, however, he has shown leadership, and that's not because he woke up one day and said, I'm going to do this because I'm in a good mood. It's because of Reverend Al Sharpton. It's because of the justice groups all over New York City and New York State who have been pushing this for decades. And as Reverend Sharpton rightly said just then, it isn't just about him. There are many groups, the December 12th movement, numbers and numbers of groups in New York who have been fighting this fight for as long as Reverend Sharpton has, if not longer. And as Reverend Sharpton said, well, maybe they don't get along, but the fact is that this is a significant step forward. I don't think it's everything. I do think it's a major thing. There is always more that can be done. And that will have to continue to be done. It is also down to all of the people in the street who marched. Here is a little bit more from Reverend Sharpton, and this will be, I hope, better audio than what you've heard. But Governor Andrew Cuomo became the first governor in this country to do this. And here's the other thing that's very important. He also issued an executive order that mandates that local police departments develop reform plans, and must be done not just because they want to do it by themselves. They have to consult with the communities that are being policed and get their input on this. They've got to be at the table while this stuff is happening. And if they don't do this by April the 1st of 2021, they will not get any state funding whatsoever. I think that is a major, major thing. In fact, I think that is as big as the banning of chokeholds and the banning of these false race-based, these racist 911 calls to police and everything else. I mean, these are big measures. And this is what happens when you and me and all of us who care about justice, who care about changing the society and getting rid of a system that has absolutely oppressed black people, brown people, native people, oppressed all manner of people in violent ways, women being oppressed, gay people being oppressed, trans people being oppressed. The violence against the trans community, against the black trans community in particular, must end. And it is hostile and toxic. And it is literally killing black trans people. This is a movement that means something. This is not a moment. When you have a governor of the most high-profile state in the country, basically, in New York State, and then there's California, the two most high-profile states in the country, signing legislation like this, this is a huge day for New York State. Now the other 49 states must follow suit. Here is Reverend Al Sharpton with additional comments, and I think you'll be able to hear this a lot more clearly.
These bills mean some substantive change so that we won't be sitting here going over this after the next funeral and after the next situation. There's no governor in this country that has said what he said this morning. To say that every mayor must come up with a plan along these areas or they would withhold state money is a model for where we ought to be dealing with 21st century civil rights in this country. Make no mistake, this is a new level that all other 49 governors ought to look at.
And I agree. I agree totally. Next. What will the average white person do this November? And if you call yourself one of those average white persons, what will you do this November 3rd, 2020?
This in your local newspapers or seen it on the evening news. That's right. We are living in an era marked by the spread of integration and miscegenation. The Brown decision. The Brown decision, forced upon us by the Jewish-controlled puppets on the U.S. Supreme Court, compelling white children to go to school with an inferior race, is the final nail in a coffin, is the final nail in a black coffin towards America becoming a mongrel nation. We had a great way of life. We had a great way of life.
That was a clip from Spike Lee's 2018 film, Black Klansman, for which he won an Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay. You heard there the voice of Alec Baldwin, who near the beginning of that film pretends to, or is portraying, a racist from the South in the 1950s, I guess. It could be any time, though. And we see that this is exactly what Donald Trump is. He is absolutely a racist, and he absolutely has decided that he hates America. And that's not a surprise. He is thrown in his lot with the Confederacy. Some have been calling him the second president of the Confederacy. I think that's even too kind. Way too kind. He is that and far worse. And you can't get too much worse than the Confederacy in this country. But he certainly is that and a whole lot worse. Spike Lee, by the way, has a new film out, and I talked about it yesterday, and I've written about it. You can find my review of it. It's called Da 5 Bloods. Da 5 Bloods. D-A, the number 5, and then the word Bloods. Da 5 Bloods is now on Netflix worldwide, streaming there. You should watch that movie. 2 hours and 35 minutes. My one criticism of the movie, it's a bit long. Needed to be edited a little bit. And it does sprawl a little bit in places. But the message of that movie is unmistakably clear. And Spike Lee is none if not someone who is a very resonant messenger. And he knows how to get his point across cinematically in an extraordinary way. He is one of the best storytellers that filmmaking has ever had, particularly when it comes to issues of race and justice and humanity, and how he portrays that in his film work. Da 5 Bloods, now playing all on Netflix. And by the way, again, you can find my review of it. I have attached a link to my review in the liner notes on Apple. So if you get this podcast from Apple Podcasts, you'll be able to see the link to my review, and also on the homepage of my website for film, popcornreel.com. And of course, I'm on Twitter at the same place. It's at the popcornreel. And the article, once again, that I did, the review I did on Da 5 Bloods, is available at the website, my website, popcornreel.com. So I say that to go into this. What is uncertain is where each and every individual white person stands. It is clear that there are, of course, now significant numbers of white people who stand very much on the side of justice, on the side of anti-racism, on the side of Black Lives Matter. And it is very clear that most of those white people are significantly younger, as they always are. It is always young people, the newer generation coming up, that always advocates for these kinds of changes. It's never really been the older set, so to speak. It is a nation and generation, subsequent generations of younger people who have always historically pushed for something greater, something more just, something far better, and something more inclusive. Study all the movements in the world and you will see that all of them, in mostly large part, in greatly large part, were started and populated vastly by younger people. Remember, Abby Hoffman once said this. The white American activist once said famously, "You can't trust anybody over 30. He said that for a reason. In the 1960s, Abby Hoffman, the young have always fueled movements, always. And believe me, the young are going to be targeted yet again for Republicans to steal their vote. Just as they've already been targeted this year in primaries. I talked about that in yesterday's episode, about Republicans stealing your vote and trying to force you to leave the long, long line that you will probably be standing on November 3rd, unless you vote by mail. That is if the United States Postal Service is still in existence in 5 months. Just under 5 months now. But the issue really is, what will the average white person do? What will you do this November? Are you going to vote for Donald Trump? Are you going to vote for Donald Trump again? Maybe you voted for him in 2016. Maybe your spouse is voting for him now, is going to vote for him in 2020. Maybe your spouse has tried to persuade you to vote for him. Maybe your spouse is telling you that you better vote for him. Maybe you're trying to convince your spouse not to vote for him. Your partner not to vote for him. Your friends not to vote for him. Your parents not to vote for him. Your boyfriend or girlfriend not to vote for him. As I said earlier, the vast majority of white people in 2016 voted for Donald Trump. 65% of white men and 53% of white women. The question becomes, will those numbers lessen this time around? Polls in June and July mean nothing. The only poll that counts is the one on November 3rd, where you go to the voting booth, or where you, presumably before November 3rd, have mailed in your ballot, your vote by mail ballot. Because we are in a pandemic, lest we forget. But the only thing that counts, the only poll that counts, is the one on November 3rd that you participate in at the polling station. And while there'll obviously be Republican voter suppression and there'll be intimidation tactics, and the Russians are involved, while all that is going on, the question becomes, what will you as a white person, if you're listening to this, do? Will you vote for Joe Biden? Will you write in Bernie Sanders' name? Or will you vote for Donald Trump? I mean, really, you have two choices. Writing in someone's name is a vote for Donald Trump. So you have two choices on the ballot this November. And I'm sure there'll be some third-party person, a libertarian or someone else, and there already apparently is. And I don't know if she is, and I forget her name, how many states she's on the ballot in. But the point is, the reality is that person is not going to win. And there is something about white privilege that says, well, you know, I'll just vote for her anyway, or I'll vote for him anyway. Heck, my standing is not going to be affected by whomever wins because maybe, hey, you know, I'm white and I'm rich, or I'm fairly well off. My whiteness is not going to be affected, and my existence is not going to be affected. If you think that way, you better take a look at that video from June 1st of this year, when Donald Trump had police tear gassing peaceful protesters in Lafayette Park, Lafayette Square. May I remind you that those thousands of people, at least 70% of them were white. Donald Trump's base is probably around 35% at the very maximum. He is throwing his chips all in with the Confederacy. As I said earlier, white Americans are in crisis. And I'm not just talking about the economy. I'm not just talking about this coronavirus, because black folk are in crisis. For sure. Black people in America, African Americans, black Americans are in serious crisis. We have been in crisis. We have been attacked. That's our crisis for 400 plus years in this country. But white Americans now have to face these challenges of their own approach to all of this now. They are watching history. You are watching history right in front of you. You saw a man murdered right in front of you just over 2 weeks ago. What will you do now about this? What will you do now about changing your mindset? What will you do now about confronting racism in your communities, in your families? What will you do now, and then in July, and then in August, and September, and October, and on November 3rd, and beyond? When Joe Biden walks into the White House next year, and I'm very confident that he will, what will you be doing then? And in February of next year, and March, and April, and so on. This is not just a moment. This is not a moment at all. This is a movement. But this is also a crisis for white Americans. You are being squarely faced with the fact that you are really living in a country that has systematically oppressed black people and brown people and native people for centuries, and that you benefit from that, whether or not you think you are racist or not. You benefit because the system of whiteness dictates that you do. And by ceding your position of power, by pushing black candidates into office, into jobs, into power positions in jobs, that is how you elevate your privilege to elevate black people. That is how you become an anti-racist. When you advocate against racism and for those who have been discriminated against by racism, who have been kept out of jobs that you routinely walk into without another thought, even when your qualifications aren't nearly as good as the black person who is going to be given a quote-unquote courtesy interview and then discarded as soon as she walks out of the room when the interview ends. That's what using your privilege for the betterment of a whole society means. It isn't 2-minute videos in black and white. All of those individuals took a step forward in at least articulating something. And I know some people criticized some of it or all of it, and certain celebrities weren't even properly doing this. I wonder if they could just formulate a speech ad-lib by themselves without having to read a script. But my more important point is is that all of those individuals now have to start advocating for black people by doing things to help black people in their profession of acting. It is not enough to make a video that may strike at salving white guilt, but it's about a 24/7, 365 revolution of your own consciousness. It takes a lot of work, but that work must begin. I'm more hopeful about younger generations of white people. Right now, my finger is on the pause button as it concerns many other white people, however. I can't tell you what you will do on November 3rd, 2020 if you're voting here in the United States in the presidential election. You will have to tell yourself what you will do. And I hope that you do the right thing and make sure you vote out hate this November 3rd. Thank you for listening to this edition of The Politicrat. And by the way, in Palmdale, California yesterday, a young black man, he was just 23 years of age, was found lynched, hanging from a tree in Palmdale, California. His name was Robert Fuller. A year ago, 4 white teachers, including a school principal, were smiling for the cameras, holding up nooses at a Palmdale school in Southern California. Just a year ago, they were suspended. This is an elementary school in Palmdale. Once again, my finger for much of white America is stuck on pause. Once again, thank you for listening to this edition of The Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore.